Hello, everybody. I'm just going to let everyone populate into our live session here. And we're all pouring in. Okay. Hi, everyone, again, and welcome to our first webinar of the new year, the new Uniform Guidance and Compliance Supplement, Tools for Grants Professionals and Auditors. My name is Des Cruz, and I'm the Programs Coordinator at the AGA National Office. Thank you again for joining us today. We are so thrilled to be able to continue to provide virtual learning for you all during this unprecedented time. And of course, thank you all for your continued support of AGA. For the next few minutes, I will be going over a few reminders for AGA webinars. So first, let's discuss the AGA membership. If you don't already know, AGA membership does have its privileges. For our current AGA members on our webinar today, thank you for being a member, and please make sure that you are taking advantage of everything AGA has to offer you. In addition to the membership privileges you just saw, AGA membership benefits do add up. As shown on this slide, there are a lot of current member benefits, and we have big plans for providing even more value to your membership in the future. For the non-members on our webinar today, consider joining AGA. Here's what some of our members say what AGA means to them. You can also jot down the links at the bottom of this slide if you are interested in joining AGA. As shown on your screen, the slides for this webinar are in the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel. There are two PDF options of the slides for you to download. One option has just one slide per page, and the other option has 2 slides per page. If you have not already, please go ahead and download the slides now so you may follow along with our speakers for today. If you have any questions for our speakers throughout today's webinar, you may input your questions in the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. Simply click the question mark icon on the right-hand side of your screen to expand the section. Then type in your question and click send. Through this platform, you unfortunately will not be able to see each other's questions. In addition to asking questions, you will also have a chance to participate in some polling questions. When a polling question is activated, it should pop up as shown on the slide here. When the polling question pops up, you will be able to select your answer, then click the submit button. As a word of caution, you may need to enable pop-ups on your browser for this polling feature to work. Now I want to make sure you all can hear me and know how to ask us questions, so I have a few trivia questions for you. To join in our trivia for today, please listen to the trivia question I asked, then type in your answer through the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. Again, please listen to the trivia question I asked, then type in your answer to the question section of your GoToWebinar control panel. All right, I hope you all are ready. We are only 13 days into the new year, so we do have a New Year's theme for our 3 questions today. So our first trivia question is, what is the most popular New Year's resolution? A, save money, B, lose weight, or C, get organized? And remember, to send us your answer, please use the question section in your GoToWebinar control panel. So I have a couple answers in, lots of B's. I'll give you guys another few seconds. Okay. Oh, there was 1 C, 2 C's. Okay, the overwhelming answer was the correct answer. B, lose weight. Yes, all of us probably have our quarantine weight, so it's probably what's on our mind right now. All right, moving on to our next trivia question. So our next trivia question is, how do you say Happy New Year in Spanish? So just please excuse my American accent while I try to say these phrases. A, Feliz Ano Novo. B, Sin Yen Kuai La. Or C, Feliz Año Nuevo. How do you say Happy New Year in Spanish? Lots of unsures for this one. There you go. All right. Good job, everybody. The answer for this was C. And if you were wondering, the other two answers were Portuguese and Mandarin. And our final trivia question, which film has the highest box office sales of all time on New Year's Day? A, Avatar, B, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, or C, the Titanic? I'm sorry. For this one, I will be launching a poll, so I want to make sure you all know that you can answer polling questions on this platform. So instead of submitting your answers through the question section, I'm going to launch a poll right now. So the poll should be up on your screen. Which film has the highest box office sales of all time on New Year's Day? Avatar, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, or the Titanic? Give you all a few more seconds to put your answers in. Okay, I'm closing the poll. Sharing our results here. So about same, Avatar, Titanic for votes, 40%, 37%. So what was the answer? The answer was A, Avatar. I thought that was really interesting too. All right, thank you everyone for participating in our trivia today. I'm glad you all can hear me and know how to ask questions and answer polls for today. So next up, we have CPEs. For continuing professional education credits, or CPEs, you will see letters on random slides throughout this webinar. Keep in mind the letters are not a pop-up box. They are embedded on random slides throughout the webinar, and you will need to write them down. For example, on this slide, the letter Z in the upper left-hand corner in the red box would be your CPE tracking letter that you would need to write down. As a reminder, all participants must attend the webinar in its entirety to receive CPE credits. Partial credits will not be issued. Additionally, announcing the letters to fellow attendees is against NASWA policy, and you may be ineligible to earn the CPE credits for this webinar. So what do you do with your CPE letters? At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey should automatically appear for you to input your CPE letters. If your survey does not appear, please click on the exit button on the bottom right hand of your screen to exit the webinar, and the survey should appear after you exit. And we will remind you at the very end in case you forget. So again, for those just joining us, we had a lot of you come in while I was doing trivia, so welcome. This is our webinar on Uniform Guidance, the new Uniform Guidance and Compliance Supplement, Tools for Grant Professionals and Auditors. I'm Destin Screws, and I'm the Programs Coordinator at the AHA National Office. As a special note, we do have a really large audience today, so as a reminder, this webinar is 100% web-based, and it actually uses the internet at your current location, at your home or your office. So if you do experience any lagging or freezing, please try to disable all devices that are not currently in use so you can receive faster internet bandwidth. So as shown on the screen here, the slides for this webinar are in the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel. There are two PDF options of the slides for you to download. One option has just one slide per page, and the other option has 2 slides per page. If you have not already, please go ahead and download the slides so you may follow along with our speakers for today. In addition to asking questions, you will also have a chance to participate in some polling questions. When a polling question is activated, it should pop up as shown on the slide here. When the polling question pops up, you will be able to select your answers and click the Submit button. As a word of caution, you may need to enable pop-ups on your browser for this polling feature to work. For continuing professional education credits, you will see letters on random slides throughout this webinar. Keep in mind the letters are not a pop-up box. They are embedded on random slides throughout the webinar, and you will need to write them down. For example, on this slide, the letter Z in the upper left-hand corner in the red box would be your CPE tracking letter that you would need to write down. As a reminder, all participants must attend the webinar in its entirety to receive CPE credits. Partial credits will not be issued. Additionally, announcing the letters to fellow attendees is against NASPA policy, and you may be ineligible to earn the CPE credits for this webinar. At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey should automatically appear for you to input your CPE letters. If this survey does not appear, please click on the exit button on the bottom right-hand side of your screen to exit the webinar, and the survey should appear after you exit. Again, if the survey does not appear, click on the exit button on the bottom right-hand side of your screen to exit the webinar, and the survey should appear after you exit. And now, without further ado, your moderator for today's webinar is Bert Nearing. Mr. Nearing is a partner with the public accounting consulting and technology firm of Crow LLP. Mr. Nearing has been in the public accounting profession for over 30 years and has been responsible for planning, administering, and supervising audit, accounting, and consulting service engagements for governmental, education, and not-for-profit entities. He has extensive experience with Uniform Grant Guidance compliance, compliance auditing, performance auditing, internal auditing, enterprise risk management, internal controls, federal grant administration, and standards implementation. He has also presented seminars to a number of professional organizations on accounting, auditing, and reporting issues in the public sector throughout the United States. He has also been a guest lecturer at the University of Illinois at Chicago on governmental and nonprofit accounting and accounting information systems. Mr. Nearing holds a Bachelor of Arts in Accounting and Business Administration from Wartburg College and is a certified public accountant and chartered global management accountant. Bert, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Des, and it is my pleasure to be here with you today, and I think we have a great panel for you, a very timely topic with regards to the uniform guidance. And what we'd like to do is just to kind of understand a little bit more who is in the audience today. So we do have some polling questions, and hopefully you learned how to utilize the polling function during Des's warm-up here today. So what we'd like to understand is just a little bit about you and where you're employed. So the first question is, my place of employment is A, federal agency, B, state or local government, C, higher education, D, nonprofit organization, or E, I'm with an accounting, auditing, or consulting company. So Des, if you can open up the poll, please.
Everyone, the poll should be on your screen. Go ahead and click your answer and click submit. So I see a lot of people entering answers into the questions box on GoToWebinar. You can actually select the poll directly on your screen and click submit so we can tally your answer. There you go. Okay, perfect. I'm going to close this poll out. There you go, Bert.
All right, very good. Thank you so much. And it looks like we have 23 members here today, or individuals here today with the federal agencies, about 61% with the state and local, and then 11% with accounting, auditing, or consulting companies. And so, and then about 5% with higher ed or non-for-profit. So thank you all for joining us. It's very helpful for the speakers to understand who is with us today. We do have two more polling questions. The next one, my primary role or job function is, and if you can pick only one, pick the one that best fits your situation. So A is I'm in grants administration, B, auditing or accounting, C, procurement, D, contracting or compliance, or E, I'm with an academic related field. So if you can open that up, Des, thank you.
Remember to select the answer on your screen and click Submit. Okay, perfect. I'm closing this poll now.
All right, very good. Thank you. So about 14% of you are in grants or grants-related field. About 80% are auditing and accounting related. So welcome. And the remainder, 7% in procurement, contracting, compliance, or in an academic-related field. Let's go to our third and final polling question. My experience with the Uniform Guidance and Compliance Supplement is: A, I'm an expert and have each section memorized. B, I regularly refer to either or both to perform my job duties. C, I occasionally refer to either or both to perform my job duties. D, I rarely use either or both. I don't know about either or both the Uniform Guidance or Compliance Supplement.
The poll's on your screen now. Give it a few more seconds. This one is taking a little bit longer. Okay, closing the poll.
Okay, thank you. We do have 1% of you are an expert, and so we'll certainly look for you to answer any of the difficult questions we might get as panelists here. But I do see that we do have a number of folks that regularly or occasionally refer to the Uniform Guidance or Compliance Supplement. And speaking from someone who's worked in the auditing field for a number of years, they are very important documents to utilize. And for those of you who haven't used it or don't know about it, we hope that you will learn a lot, and it'll be the beginning of a better understanding of the compliance supplement as well as the uniform guidance. So we're looking forward to presenting to you. So thank you so much for answering those polling questions. That does give us a good idea of who is with us here today and helps us tailor our presentation. I'd next like to introduce our speakers, and I think we have a great panel here for you today. Our first speaker up today is Barry Davis. Barry's portfolio at GAO includes financial and performance audit work related to improper payments, grants management, accountability, inspectors general, healthcare financial management, and state and local government financial management. During fiscal year 2020, Barry assumed the audit responsibilities for reviewing selected internal controls in various federal programs receiving COVID-19 funding, and very important area, obviously, this year as there was a significant amount of funding for COVID-related matters. Our second speaker is George Strudgeon, who is an audit director at the Virginia Auditor of Public Accounts, where he leads the statewide single audit team. Additionally, George serves on the steering committee for AGA's Intergovernmental Partnership. The Intergovernmental Partnership produces products which can be found at the Intergov section of AGA's website. And certainly, for those of you who haven't visited that section of the website, please do. There are a lot of great resources there for you as you practice your trade. Our third speaker is the Single Audit Coordinator for the Department of Health and Human Services, Ms. Tammy Brown. Ms. Brown is responsible for overseeing the quality of single audits of non-federal HHS grantees. This oversight requires that Ms. Brown represent the department as an active participant in various OMB working groups and committees related to single audits. Ms. Brown is also involved in the development, review, and editing of the general sections and Part 4 programs for HHS programs. The NEAR group that Ms. Brown oversees is responsible for providing technical assistance to auditors, grantees, and federal program officials. So thank you once again to Barry, George, and Tammy for joining us here today, and I will turn it over to Barry.
Thank you, Bert. I'm trying to get my screen set, so that's good. Okay,
There you go.
I think I've got it now. Great. Thanks so much, Bert. I'm really happy to be here with you today, along with Tammy and George. This is really a very interesting and timely topic. And some of the areas that I want to cover are, and I put this on the slide, GAO's role related to both the Uniform Guidance and Single Audit, key changes in the Uniform Guidance, key changes in the Compliance Supplement, including the Addendum. GAO's work on a couple of working groups related to single audits and things related to all things COVID. So through the slides, there are a number of hot links, and I'll try to point those out to you. Just to kind of set the stage here, OMB's Uniform Guidance is a set of authoritative rules and regulations about federal grants. It's located in Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations, also known as 2 CFR, more specifically in Part 200. But it's really designed to kind of keep everybody on the same page in the grants community relative to accountability. The Uniform Guidance and the Compliance Supplement are produced by OMB, and it's really OMB's way of implementing the Single Audit Act. So if you look at it from a hierarchy standpoint, you've got the Single Audit Act, then you have the Uniform Guidance, and then you have, of course, the Compliance Supplement. You may be wondering what GAO's role is relative to all of this. I mean, we don't write the guidance, OMB does that. We don't do single audits either, but we do have a long history of working with OMB and the federal agencies to ensure that that guidance is there and that it's effective and helpful in overseeing the single audit process. We have testified before Congress on the single audit process, and included in those testimonies, we've talked about federal agency oversight of single audits. We also, as many of you know, published the Yellow Book, Government Auditing Standards, and these are used in conjunction with the generally accepted auditing standards and the Uniform Guidance by auditors when they perform their single audits. Oh, lastly, I'll just mention that, like a lot of other people here, we did propose revisions to the Uniform Guidance this past summer. Okay, so the new Uniform Guidance, it was issued in August of this past year, and the revisions to the guidance were effective in November with a couple of exceptions. The key changes that OMB has really set out in this guidance, they're kind of three different buckets or three scope areas, and I'll go through each of them. The first one has to do with supporting the implementation of the President's management agenda regarding results-oriented accountability for grants. This is also known as CAP Goal 8. For those who may not be familiar with the acronym, CAP Goal, or CAP stands for Cross-Agency Priority Goal. And these are goals that are applicable to all agencies, not just to a specific agency. The second scope area has to do with meeting statutory requirements and aligning with other authoritative sources, and then clarifying existing requirements is the third scope area. So talking about the first scope area, the President's management agenda, you'll really see here a shift from compliance to performance. So specifically, there's an emphasis on the importance of focusing on performance to achieve program results. And you know, an example of this is 2 CFR 200.102, which has to do with exceptions. And here, agencies are really encouraged to get exceptions for certain requirements if they support some type of innovative solution that could be helpful in holding recipients accountable for good performance. You know, you'll kind of see here a pivoting, so to speak, towards a focus on stewardship and the results of what the the value of the money. Where is the money going, and is the general public getting value for that money in those grants funds? So auditors may, of course, step back a minute and say, well, this is all well and good, but is there criteria? And I think everybody recognizes that there does need to be objective and measurable criteria when you're moving into the area of performance. But I think that's a work in progress, and I think we're going to see how that works out with different people collaborating on that subject matter. Secondly, the important point here on this slide is the requirement that agencies adopt standard data elements for the information that recipients are required to report. And again, this kind of links with technology and how can we better manage data and use it for decision making. And then other revisions include making indirect cost rates transparent and clarifying the termination provision. So, the latter, of course, is to strengthen the awarding agency's ability to terminate federal awards if they deem or determine that that award is no longer achieving its program goal. In the second major scope area, OMB is revising its guidance to align with relevant statutory requirements as well as GASB principles. For example, OMB is aligning its guidance with several requirements in the National Defense Authorization Act and other legislation, and here a good example that many people may be familiar with is the change in the micro purchase threshold, which has increased from 3,500 to 10,000. So in the third major area of changes in uniform guidance to clarify existing requirements, the first bullet here you'll see clarifies some frequently asked questions that were in the old release or related to the old release. And then again, here the intent is to make sure that there's no misinterpretation. So this was an important factor in updating this guidance. Clarifying the responsibilities of pass-through entity to address only a subrecipient's audit findings related to their specific subaward, and then clarifying the documentation requirement for using the de minimis indirect cost rate. And here, this clarifies that any non-federal entity that doesn't have a current negotiated indirect cost rate, they can now use the 10% de minimis rate, and they don't have to show documentation for it. So that was a good, important clarification. This is the numbering system for the original guidance and the revised uniform guidance. It's important to look at this. There are some added provisions, and an example that I'll share with you is 200.322, which has to do with domestic preferences for procurement. And here, the exercise is to look at the agencies, or not the agencies, or the vendors that you're working with, and if you are a federal award recipient, trying to work with those entities that are in fact producing goods in the United States, goods or services within the U.S. The 2020 compliance supplement came out in August, and it was effective for fiscal years after June 30th, 2019. It's available on OMB's website. There's a hot link here that you can use to find that particular guidance. So there are a few changes in the guidance I wanted to highlight. Part 2, which has to do with the matrix. Part 3, the compliance requirements. Part 4, agency program requirements. And Part 8, the Appendix 7 on other audit advisories. So if you look at the matrix, this sets out all of the individual programs. That you can see the program numbers on the far left column. It also has the 12 different types of compliance requirements that are listed across. You will see here that in a number of cases there is highlighting in yellow and bolding, and this is to indicate that the compliance requirements have changed in those particular categories. Now the sixth requirement mandate is still there, but it's important for you to look at this because in many cases the agencies for certain programs are changing those 6 requirements. So be sure to check this out, and of course if it's a yes, it means it's the requirement is there. A no indicates the requirement is not subject to audit for that program. Some other key changes, just to point out, Part 3.1 has been removed. Auditors are now instructed to refer to Part 3.1 in the 2019 supplement. If on the occasion they are actually doing audits that continue to include older awards made prior to December 2014. And also check out the agency program requirements. There have been a number of programmatic changes here. There are several programs with additions and deletions, as well as programs with significant changes. So looking at Appendix 5 is probably the best way to actually drill down and identify those changes. Appendix 7 now is, also is important because it forms the primary COVID-19 guidance, and I say primary because we're going to talk about the addendum in a second, but the primary guidance separates the identification of COVID-19 related awards. And we're not just talking about new award programs or new programs under COVID-19, we're talking about existing awards that had COVID-19 funding. So there needs to be a separate identification, and then audit findings should include the COVID-19 identification for those new or existing awards or programs. On December 22nd, 2020, OMB issued the compliance supplement addendum. I think everybody was very happy that it finally came out. It's been a tough year for everybody, including OMB, and thank you, OMB, for finally giving us guidance in this area. The guidance is effective for audits of fiscal years beginning after June 30th, 2019, and of course must be used in conjunction with the 2020 compliance supplement. There is an extension here, a 3-month extension. I think a lot of people are happy about this too. It moves the audit reporting package submission date for 3 months for single audits for the fiscal year end through September 30th of 2020. But it's important to note that's only if the recipient received COVID-19 funding. It also includes new compliance requirements for 14 COVID-19 funded programs and 1 non-COVID-19 program. So if you look at this slide, you can see these are the 14 with the plus, the 14 and the non-COVID. And a lot of these, I think, are programs many of you are working with, the Coronavirus Relief Fund, Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, Provider Relief Fund. Some of these are names that are familiar to you, but certainly this guidance now is very helpful in the areas where there were a number of questions in the past. A couple other important things to point out on this slide relative to the addendum, and that has to do with reporting compliance requirements. For audits with fiscal years beginning after June 30th, 2019, auditors must test compliance with Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, also called FFATA, subrecipient reporting requirements, for all COVID-19 programs included in the addendum. The interesting thing too is that it also talks to fiscal years ending after September 30th, 2020, and in those cases, FFATA requirements will apply to all major programs or selected programs, regardless of whether they receive COVID funding. Another important point that you might be interested in if you're involved in student financial assistance has to do with some waivers or changes for certain institutions, and auditors can use this link here. We've got a hot link for you on Education's website. You can use this as a resource in developing your audit testing. Regarding Appendix 7, other audit advisories and the supplement addendum, a couple of people have been asking, what about PPE? Non-federal entities that receive donated personal protection equipment should report the fair market value at time of receipt as a standalone footnote accompanying the schedule of expenditures federal awards. So now you have a little bit more information on what you need to do relative to PPE. Also, the guidance documents do not require, people have been asking, I'll be back in a second, people have been asking, well, what level of authority are all of these other documents that are coming out from the agencies, the guidance that we're getting from the agencies? And OMB has made a statement here that the agency guidance documents do not create new compliance requirements. Auditors should refer to a statute, regulation, or term and condition as a requirement for an audit finding. So I want to share a little bit of information with you about a couple of working groups that we've been involved in at GAO. In 2019, the Comptroller General established a working group to evaluate single audit issues. It included a lot of people, inspectors general, state auditors, representatives from the National Association of State Auditors, Comptrollers, and Treasurers, also known as NASAC, American Institute of CPAs. Members of the working group discussed single audit topics such as the compliance supplement, federal audit clearinghouse, recurring audit findings. And here I just want to highlight just a few things. Regarding the compliance supplement, a lot of people were interested in seeing if that could be issued sooner. Maybe, April 1st of each year would really be ideal for people who are trying to get their audit planning in place. Also, there was some suggestion that maybe the people that are actually developing the guidance in the agencies could get a little bit more training. And just again, to make everything clear, even though OMB is the one who issues the guidance, the agencies themselves are the ones that develop those initial drafts and funnel them through for OMB, and they're really the ones, because they know their programs, they know what they need and what they want, and so they're trying to give guidance to the auditors as to how to accomplish that. But they're those people, although they might be very good writers and know their programs very well, sometimes they are not auditors or have audit backgrounds or experiences. So sometimes, getting those people together with the auditors could be helpful, and making sure that, they've had sufficient training so that they know how to develop a good audit guidance. The Federal Audit Clearinghouse, everybody knows this is a wonderful repository of single audit reports, and the thought is maybe we could move this a little bit more in the direction of making a decision support system, include some data analytics functions or more data analytics functions, and enhanced search capabilities. So this was another thing that was of interest to the group. And then recurring audit findings, it's sometimes a little discouraging if you're an auditor and you go in and you find the same audit finding the next year. There was a question, well, is there a way that we can enforce, the actions that need to be taken to eliminate these findings? And is there some kind of consequences or enforcement that we can establish? So these are all questions, not necessarily answers in all these areas, but they were questions, and it was good really to get people together to talk about them. I will say that this group is no longer functioning, but I want to mention another group that GAO has been involved in, and this is what we call the COVID-19 Accountability Working Group. And this is a group that actually GAO and NASAC has put together. We've been meeting since May of this past year. The intent is to share information, communicate needed guidance, promote transparency, discuss some of the issues that are associated with financial management of these COVID-19 funds. These recurring meetings provide updates on oversight, accountability, reporting requirements, auditing requirements. They include a lot of different people in addition to NASAC, in addition to GAO. There are people from PRAC, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. There are inspectors general that participate. There are people from the Association of Local Government Auditors. They're included in there as well. So it's really a good, diverse group. And Kenny Pointer, who actually has the platform for this, he is the executive director of NASAC, and he has said that if anybody else is interested in participating in these conversations, you can email him and let him know. His email address is kpoynter@nasac.org. So I think that's it. Bert, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Barry, and that is very helpful. I know that there were a lot of changes this year, especially with regards to the uniform guidance, and correspondingly quite a few changes in the compliance supplement as well. I just wanted to ask a couple questions. In your presentation, you mentioned GAO's role related to single audits and uniform guidance, and I think it would be helpful for our audience to understand. You stated that in addition to GAO issuing audit standards for government audit professionals, GAO has given testimonies and produced reports with recommendations related to federal agency oversight of single audits. Can you give a few examples of those testimonies and reports, and what messages were you conveying?
Good question, Bert. One report that we did just a few years ago, 2017, I'd like to highlight that because In that report and in that 8th audit that we did, we looked at the 5 largest grant-making agencies, and we were looking for things. For example, if a single audit is conducted, is the agency looking to see whether that audit is conducted, whether it gets into the fact, what oversight do agencies provide there? Related to that, what about management decisions? Are these being made? Is somebody monitoring and making sure that those management decisions are actually being made and being carried out? And then thirdly, the whole issue about the recurring audit findings. What are agencies doing if there are recurring audit findings or high-risk findings? What are they doing? What actions are they taking? And it was interesting because with the exception of education, we had HHS, transportation, HUD, trying to think of all of the 5, but with the exception of education, the 5 agencies, the 5 largest grant-making agencies, had weaknesses in all of those areas, or some of those areas, depending on the agency. And so we had about 20 recommendations that we made. Most of those, and this has been a few years now, most of those have been actually implemented, so we're very happy to hear about that. The message here, too, is part of our message is that, a lot of the policies and procedures are great if they've been established, but, are they actually being implemented? So it's good to have, good guidance, single audit guidance relative to the uniform guidance and compliance supplement. But in addition, we need to make sure that, that people are mindful that those, those requirements of this particular portions of those guidance documents are actually, being implemented. There are, and I won't belabor the point other than to say that, we've done a lot of work, and we've done testimonies over the years. In 2011, we had kind of a great landmark testimony, if you want to call it that, where we talked about all of the recommendations that we had made in previous years relative to compliance with the Single Audit Act. So we've got a long list of areas where we have participated via audits and testimonies to try to encourage people to have accountability in this area.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to follow also up on you mentioned the COVID-19 accountability work group with GAO and NASAC collaborations. Can you provide a little more information about what you have discussed in these sessions?
Oh, yeah, very happy to. I mean, we actually met yesterday, so time is good. And we have, yesterday, I think the major piece of our topic was the new COVID relief package. And, what was in there and how did that affect people, whether you're administrators or whether you're auditors. We talked about some new programs that came out of that. And also we had presentations. The agenda normally includes a 5 or 10 minute presentation from people such as, of course, at NASAC, GAO, but also OMB, as well as the Treasury IG, people who are, involved in writing guidance. And then a lot of other IGs also participate in this, and ALCA participates. And so, and we just have a lot of good input, diverse input, and it's a great exchange of information. So I think it's a good group if anybody continues to have an interest in, in this area. Okay,
great. And also, I just wanted to follow up with you with regards to the Single Audit Working Group and the Comptroller General that was convened more than a year ago. What were some of the issues discussed, and are those issues still relevant today?
Absolutely, Bert. I think they are still relevant. The compliance supplement, can we get it out the door? Can it be issued a little earlier? That would be helpful. Well, let's make sure that there's collaboration between OMB, the agencies, and the stakeholders, to make sure that guidance is written, the compliance supplement is written so that, the auditors, so that it achieves the program's goals, but auditors are able to actually implement that or do their audits based on that. And so, yeah, that and the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, again, another great tool that we can use, great repository of single audit information. And then, the recurring audit findings, not to be, too repetitious, but that's still something I think that people want to, to work on and see how we can kind of get some enforcement in that area. Yeah, I think they're all still relevant today. Thanks, Bert.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, Barry. That's been very helpful and informative. And we will be, as people, audience members submit questions, we will be leaving time at the end to cover those questions. So certainly thank you. We are getting some very good questions in, so we'll cover those a little bit later. I would now like to turn the presentation over to George.
Thank you, Bert. I just want to make sure, can you hear me okay? All right, I see nods, that's good. I'm gonna go ahead and get started. There's my information. I was asked today to talk about communicating key audit matters in an independent auditor's report, other times referred to as CAMs. And so I was asked to talk about that within the context of a compliance audit, the single audit. And so I'm going to talk about today about, first I'm going to lay out what is the CAM, those key audit matters, what are they, why are you starting to hear more about them, and then how do they fit into the confines of a compliance audit, and then I'll touch about how CAMs are basically communicated. And then we'll talk about COVID-19. And just to make sure, I'm kind of going to flip this from what you may think if you are familiar with CAMs. So first, let's talk about where are CAMs covered, and they're discussed in AUC 701, and they're effective for audits of financial statements. Now remember, that's for financial statements for periods ending on or after December 15th, 2021. So here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have a 6/30 year end, and so it will not be effective. I like to think of it not at the beginning, like when does the fiscal year begin, but when does it end? And so our first financial statement audit report that could potentially, and I'll get to where it comes from, wouldn't be until our 2022 audit. Now, I say potentially because it applies to audits when an auditor is engaged to do a complete set of the general purpose financial statements when the auditor is engaged. Engaged is a key word there because to communicate key audit matters. It's not a mandatory requirement. It's not, the auditor can't inadvertently do this on their own. They have to be engaged by their client, the auditee, in order to provide those key audit matters and communicate it when their auditors report. Now that's why you're probably hearing more about, well, key audit matters. And so we had what I want to talk about. We had 23% of the participants today were federal participants, and with 80%, 14 dealing with auditing and accounting, and 14% dealing with grants. So you may be hearing about this term out there and people discussing CAMs, but that would only relate to the financial statements per the audit standards, and that's how they could be implemented. Now, as you all know, if there's also a set of audit standards, a section of the audit standards, Section 935, that relate to compliance audit. Now, within that section of the standard, there's a phrase in there, I'm paraphrasing greatly, that says, an auditor can look to the other audit standards, and in certain circumstances, where it says material misstatement, replace it with material noncompliance, and so that they can adapt those other standards, the whole body of audit standards, to their compliance audit. But inside AUC 935, it's actually an appendix at the end. It talks about, well, which one of the other audit standards cannot be adopted to a compliance audit. And believe it or not, it actually says AUC 701 is not applicable to a compliance audit. So that first part, I just want to make sure, where I talk about CAMs being applicable to financial statements, and then starting, I think, for our fiscal year 2022, and being engaged, this next, when you get into the actual compliance part, which is the governing audit standards for issuing an opinion on compliance in a single audit, it says that you can't do that. So I just want to kind of frame that out. So how to determine CAMs in a compliance audit? Now, from the poll, it seems like there were both auditees and auditors in this webinar. So where would you go? And so if AUC Section 701, let's kind of mirror the two and talk about, well, where does Section 701, how does it define it, and what does it say the auditor should do? And then let's look to uniform guidance for where you can kind of draw a parallel, if you can, to kind of see. And this will also give you an idea of why the auditing standards didn't need to bring in CAMs into the same set of standards that you would for financial statements. And so a CAM in 701 are those matters that the auditor's professional judgment were the most significant in the audit of the financial statements of the current period. Key audit matters are selected from matters communicated to those charged with governance. So see, we have those things that are significant to the audit. And so that, I just want to make sure clear that in 701, they are not a replacement for management's disclosure. The CAMs are not a replacement for the auditor providing a modified opinion. It's not where you communicated in CAM. It's not where the auditor would address ongoing concern or provide opinions on individual items. It's not a substitute for those other items. It's specifically for the items the auditor did that were significant to the audit that the auditor performed. Well, uniform guidance, let's get into this. And I try to use highlighting. So if one's highlighted green above, it means that I think there's a correlation to the next one. People could disagree, but this is just my own personal view. So in uniform guidance, for federal awarding agencies' responsibilities, it's to provide OMB with annual updates to the compliance supplement and work with OMB to ensure that the compliance supplement focuses the auditor. Again, focuses the auditor. That's the federal awarding agency has to give OMB information for the compliance supplement annually to help focus us, the auditor. I point to us because I'm an auditor, if you remember that from my background. So to test the compliance requirements that are most likely to cause improper payments, fraud, waste, abuse, and generate an audit finding for which the federal awarding agency will take sanctions. So that of all the items that I could potentially audit for compliance, it is the compliance supplement and the federal awarding agency that is supposed to communicate to me through OMB of those items that are the significant and that are most likely to cause improper payment, and the federal awarding agency could take action, sanctions. Well, now, what do I communicate as an auditor? Well, there's a whole list, and I won't go through them all, but when I go out and I test those items as instructed in the compliance supplement that will end up in a significant deficiency, a material weakness, or non-compliance, or question costs, $25,000 or more, I am then responsible for then communicating it. So to the federal agency through the Single Audit report, which Barry talked about, the Federal Audit Clearinghouse is where the federal awarding agencies and pass-through agencies are required to go to see what I communicate in my audit findings as a result of the audit. So with that said, so how to determine a CAM in a single audit? Auditors do not. This isn't something that I just wake up one day and I go, okay, what is my key audit matter that I need to consider? That's basically communicated through me, through the federal awarding agencies, through the compliance supplement or CS. That's the key. I would just want to reemphasize that it is the main, probably the only really avenue for communicating with what I'm supposed to audit, focus on as I do the audit. And so it's a great thing that we have the compliance supplement. Are there things about it that I would like to see improved? Yes, I can go over those later. But I sometimes when I sit down with my staff and they go, "Oh my gosh, it's 1,600 pages, George. What am I supposed to do?" And I go, "Look, I will take 1,600 pages over the alternative." And so this is really what the alternative would be. As auditors, we would have to go, it sounds silly, we'd have to go to the Constitution. Is there anything in there related to our grant or award that maybe we need to test for compliance, such as, I understand there's a focus now on auditors. I've seen it in some documents related to freedom of speech and stuff. So is there anything in there where I need to test compliance to that? We'd have to go read all the federal law that is out there related to a program that Congress has implemented. So you kind of think about, well, I got the law of the people, the Constitution. I ended up with what Congress layers on top with their law and creates. And then the federal awarding agencies through the Code of Federal Regulations. What are the rules that they are going to use in order to take what Congress has designed and implement it into practice? I'd have to read that and figure out what to focus in on. And then after there, the actual grant award documents, which would basically reference then either the CFR or the law as what the federal agency is expecting the recipient to comply with. So we'd have to go through that. And then it's a new kind of phenomenon. It really, given the speed, this is just a screen print out of from Treasury of all the guidance documents. So, okay, so I have law, regulations, grant award agreements, and guidance documents. Barry did talk about there is the thing that where it's not expected that guidance documents would create new compliance requirements, but it is something we need to be cognitive of as we do our single audit. So we'd have to look at all of this. And I don't think anybody would want an independent auditor going around and spending all this time, because I may choose in Virginia to audit something with if there wasn't a compliance supplement to provide focus, audit something different than maybe my counterpart in Florida or in Washington State. So it's key, because there are things in the regulations. For example, if I was auditing a meal program and they said, "Oh, well, we have tomato ketchup on the menu." There's a regulation related to, well, how thick does a sauce need to be before it could be classified as ketchup? And so you don't want me to test, well, whether the food being served meets the regulations on the density of ketchup. You want me to focus in on probably things related to eligibility, the inventory of the food and stuff, and not worry about whether Swiss cheese actually has holes and stuff. So as much as people may say, "Oh my gosh, it's 1,600 pages, it's this long document," I say, I'm glad we have it, and it is what it is, because it does provide auditors focus. So how does the compliance supplement communicate CAMs? Barry talked about this. I'm just going to reemphasize some of the things she talked about, because she talked about changes, and those changes to the compliance supplement do end up creating those focus, and one of them being the PIC 6 mandate. And that's only for programs that are in Part 4 of the compliance supplement. Auditors, we don't have the luxury of using the PIC 6 as if we have to go use Part 7 for programs that are not in the compliance supplement. So just know that it's only there for federal awarding agencies to use for programs that are in Part 4 that have a matrix in Part 2. So anyways, I just want to point that out. And so that's the 7 types of compliance requirements that federal awarding agencies want auditor test if directed material. Now, there could be things that are applicable to the auditee, such as program income. Program income could be applicable, but the federal awarding agency already knows that they have designed their program so that program income has a remote chance of being directed material, so they put it in and say it's not subject to audit. But if the auditee was to receive program income, there would still be an expectation that the auditor would test those things. And then special test and provision, those things that are unique to a program that maybe aren't covered by the other 11 types of compliance requirements. For example, if I was auditing donated foods, there's donated foods and there's special tests that they want auditors to do to make sure, one, are they doing an inventory? Are they keeping accounting records of those inventory? And then are they reconciling them too? That's very important. I know Barry already talked about what the guidance is on donated PPE, but that's different what they've said for donated food within certain program areas. So another thing that the compliance supplement does to communicate key audit matters, and kudos to the U.S. Department of Education. I use their section. They talk about, and they're splitting out things that are the responsibility of the state, what they refer to as the SEA, State Education Agency, versus the LEA, the local education agency. For preparation for this presentation, I looked. Locals have 271. LEA is referenced 271 times in the compliance supplement. And so that gives focus to those auditors that are at the local level versus at the SEA, the state education agency. Ironically, they're 100 times less. They're at 171 times referenced in the compliance supplement. So that tells me as the state auditor what are my key audit matters that I need to focus in on when testing that program at the state level versus my colleagues that do local audits would have a different key audit matters that they should be focusing in on as part of their audit. Now, they also tell us things in the compliance supplement that allow us to maybe not focus in on as such because there is a federal control in place, such as the SNAP quality control review. So they have that control, and so they let us know that that is also out there and providing some assurance. And so that tells us, well, do we need to focus on things? I also want to highlight on, I'll get into this. Some of it is a repeat of what Barry said, but I think sometimes you can't hear it enough. But I failed to mention that another thing CAMs are, and I'll break it down into three different things. Typically, they are high-risk areas in a financial statement where the auditor is providing more focus in. The compliance supplement tells auditors what programs are of higher risk. For example, the Medicaid program. So where a financial statement is for the general public and investors who may not be involved in the day-to-day management of those entities, they want to know from the auditors, well, what was the things that were of higher risk when performing that financial statement audit. The federal government is an active participant in these programs and design them, and they know which ones are high risk. So that's another reason why there isn't necessarily a requirement that why the key audit standards are not attached or can't be attached to a compliance audit, because the federal government knows what is higher risk because they're the participant in creating and designing this program. The other thing is in a financial statement, there may be things of significant management judgment, such as accounts receivable, maybe a potential liability that when there's an estimate of a cost or the asset value of an asset that requires significant management judgment. In a compliance audit, we have something different. They are, it's either you comply or you don't comply. And so hopefully that they're designed in a way, the audit objectives for us to achieve is that whether I'm auditing it or my counterparts in the other states are auditing a program, it's very much black and white on whether somebody did or did not comply with the requirement. So significant management and judgments kind of removed from there. And auditing significant events. You know, I definitely would have said year in, year out for a single audit. You know, if we'd had a program operating one way one year, it's designed and operating the same the following year up until this year. Dramatic changes. So, but again, I'll go back to my thing about the Medicaid being high risk. The federal government knows which programs have been impacted because of COVID. Unemployment insurance, the amount of claims being processed and everything else. They know of the risks that are out there. They know what that program is due. There's no reason for, I would say, for auditors to disclose or be required to disclose something that they already know. So I just wanted to kind of cover that. When we were first talking about what are key audit matters, I meant to cover those three different items. But let's talk about some of the CAMs that are in this compliance supplement addendum. Again, Barry already talked about it. And this is for both auditees and auditors. I know we have some auditees on the line. If you've been doing your FFATA reporting and your auditors haven't asked about it for several years because they took it out of the compliance supplement, I guess it's great that you're attending training like this to give you a heads up that your auditors, if they haven't already, will start asking you about your FFATA reporting. And, you know, they're an auditor's objectives. There's no secret about it. They must achieve a low control risk. And so you can tell your auditor, look, this number ties to that number, but they're going to want to know, well, where's your reconciliations? Where's your documentation? Where's your supervisory review? And all those additional questions that will relate it to internal control. Just not that you did it, but what were the controls around it? So Barry brought that up, so I just want to bring back that aspect that your auditors will be asking about. COVID programs this year, opening up next year to all programs. And if you compliance supplement, look to see if reporting is subject to audit. And then ask the second question is, well, could it be direct and material to the program? And the way to evaluate that is, well, how much of the funding is passed through to subrecipients to figure out if FFATA reporting would be direct and material to the program. Within there is USDA provided multiple program COVID-19 waivers. I'll be aware of that so that your auditors aren't asking you, well, how did you comply with the old rules? Hopefully this puts your auditors on notice to let you know that some of those old rules the federal government has waived because of COVID. This is another part. If I had to say something I've spent time dealing with, and I also know other state auditors, is that the U.S. Department of Treasury, through their FAQs, have introduced this concept that beneficiaries of CRS, in this limited cases, entities, not individuals. If you've read UG, it always talks about beneficiaries are individuals receiving benefits of a program. CRF Treasury has allowed in this limited cases for beneficiaries to be entities that would not be subject to single audit. And so not only do you not get the single audit of the beneficiary, you also then the subrecipient monitoring of that there's no longer if the entity you're providing the funding to is not a subrecipient, then the subrecipient monitoring requirements then go away. Because in theory, if they're a beneficiary, the awarding entity should have all the documentation and support that other entity needed the money as a result of COVID-19 and could satisfy all the compliance requirements at the prime recipient level, not at the next entity down. That's probably been one of the biggest things that in my circles that we've been talking about is what's this concept of beneficiaries and of entities, what's the impact on the next level down, as well as the pass-through entity or the funding entity, because they're not technically pass-through at that point. Education Stabilization Fund, they talk about there's different sub-programs, A through P. where there's no O program, I guess, because then it would look like it was just another letter in its extension, a number in its extension. Barry already talked about this, so I won't bring this up. Audit extension, I just wanted to point out, because unfortunately we can't take advantage of this in Virginia because we have a mandatory requirement, a state requirement. So even though the feds can waive or can extend their requirement to have the single audit performed in a certain amount of time, you really have to ask yourself, what does your state have a complementary requirement that the legislators set up, and then that would need to be extended. The federal government can't do that. And of course, donated PPE. Barry talked about this, but unlike the example of food, where there are special testing provisions related to food, they've, in their guidance, have said you can put donated PPE in a footnote and mark it as unaudited. And then Barry talked about this, was just the guidance documents that, and I'll take an auditor's perspective in there. That guidance goes a step further and says auditors should reference the law or regulation governing the non-compliance if they do find something. So with that, let me see, there's questions. Bert, I'll go to you.
Thank you, George, and that was very informative, and certainly I think appreciate you covering the CAMs, in detail at the end, because I do think that these are important aspects to keep in mind, and we do have some questions. Go ahead, George.
So Bert, I forgot to mention, I saw it in the chat, and I'm glad somebody brought it up. That last slide, I added at the last minute. AGA will repost it with those slides in. I apologize. I got on a roll and I forgot to mention that.
That's okay. That's very good. No, that was very helpful, and we will get additional slides on the posted, and Des will talk about that at the end. George, we have just a couple questions I wanted to ask you about related to your presentation, and thanks for going through the importance of the compliance supplement. And are there some practical things that you feel can be done to improve the compliance supplement?
Well, I'll talk about one kind of globally that Barry already talked about and the impact it has on me. And then one kind of maybe quick thing also related to something Barry talked about on really focusing on performance. One, timeliness. I have a 630 year in the federal government. Normal year only gives us 9 months to complete it. 9 months, boom. So every month that the compliance supplement comes out after fiscal year end, if you think about it, that's 11% of my total time. So if it's delayed by 1 month, let's just say it comes out the first week of August. Well, okay, that's 11%. I think Barry had reported it came out, August 14th. Okay, so that's a month and a half. It's about 15%. And anybody who works in project management, you got your scope, time, and money, and you start taking away the time, but still set the high expectations. That's just, it creates more challenges for us. So timeliness would be important. The other thing is, as the federal government goes to performance, and maybe they want a role for auditors, I want to be in a compliance audit, I need suitable audit criteria. Again, I'll go back to me and my colleagues around the other states, whether I review it or another state does, can we all come to the same conclusion? And if you talk about performance reports, the key line items that the compliance supplement can communicate those to us, then all of a sudden I know what's important to them, and I can audit what's important to them and not spend taxpayer resources to audit things that would not result in an audit finding. If I found out like, oh, well, they left off blank field, or this field was off by 20%, and the federal agency isn't going to take any sanctions or do anything with that fact that one line is off, I wouldn't see why you'd want to spend the money on tax money having me audit it.
Okay. Thank you. Another question, everyone seems to be using technology to make improvements in business processes. Do you see any way that technology could be used to make improvements in the compliance supplement?
This is one that I kind of like, because if you take the approach that with the compliance supplement is so complicated when an auditor has to use it for just one program, and most single audits are just an audit of one program. So you're talking about having to go through your part 2, the matrix. If you're lucky, it's in part 4. If it's in part 4 and you know specifically what you have to audit, you then have to consider also the internal controls that are in part 6, your auditors, the other items. So you have to work all this parts. So even if it's in part 4, you still got to go back to part 3 to find your audit objectives. And so if I think about it, there's 35,000 single audits done every year, covering over 35,000 individual programs. That means auditors are having to jump around. If the federal government, instead of doing that one large document, this is pie in the sky. I know if you could get technology to do it once to where I type in what CFDA number I'm auditing, it could produce it in the order. Well, this is the part 4 that what you need to test, the information that's specific to that program, along with the information from part 4, the audit objectives from part 3, and also with each type of compliance requirement. These are the expected internal controls you could see from part 6. I mean, I appreciate that there is such thing as a compliance supplement, but to I think reduce the risk that the federal government isn't getting quality audits, if they could create some type of, publication tool that would allow auditors to either view it in its totality as the way it is now, or see the applicable sections that they need to focus in on to. Because, at 1,600 pages, it's easy. I mean, you have to spend a considerable amount of time just knowing how all the different pieces and parts work together and make sure that they all work correctly on each individual audit for every single program.
Okay, thank you. No, certainly there are opportunities to automate a lot of things that we do. So we look forward to those kinds of changes in the future. I'm next going to turn it over to Tammy and provide some insight from a federal agency perspective. Tammy? Tammy, we are having trouble hearing you.
No, I don't hear you yet. Let me see. Tammy, Tammy, can you please dial in the PIN? There should be an access code on the audio section. I think that's one last step that you have to dial in to put in, and then we'll be able to hear you. So, thank you, everyone. Just bear with us while we get Tammy on the line. And if you go a little bit over time, it's okay as well. No, not yet. Go ahead and hang up and dial back in again.
We'll give that a try and hopefully get Tammy right with us. I think maybe we did have a couple questions. Maybe I'll go to that right now for maybe Barry and George. Just to
okay.
We got a
for me.
question with regards to PPE, and I guess there's two questions related to it. First, do we include a note on PPP only if the donation comes from a federal agency? Can you hear me now?
Well, there's Tammy back.
Yep,
right.
You're back.
Well, we have
folks.
one. That's okay, Tammy. I asked a question while we were waiting, so we'll go and answer that one, and then we'll get back right to you then, Tammy.
Well, this is George. I'll attempt to answer it, and I know Tammy was heavily involved, so by my answer. So the question being is, does the footnote only relate to federally donated PPE. And given that we're all talking about this scope in the context of federal assistance, I wouldn't see why you would bring on. So let's just say you were an entity and Walmart, hospital, and Walmart was really nice, and Walmart shipped you over some PPE. I don't know why disclosing the Walmart provided PPE, assuming it comes from from their resources and not some weird convoluted federal source, that it would only be the federal PPE that goes into the footnote. You agree, Tammy?
Absolutely. That was the intent of that, is that it would just represent the federal portion. And one of the problems that you have with the donated is many times the source of the donated PPE wasn't disclosed. It just showed up. So it would be impossible to try to capture all of that. But it seemed realistic that you may be able to capture the federal portion of that. And so that's why they went that direction.
Okay.
Right.
And just as a follow-up on that, Tammy, is there a materiality limit with regards to the disclosure of the PPP that's donated?
I believe that's a should, isn't it, George, on the final language?
Yeah,
so,
yeah, the final language, and that's Tammy's getting at, is the should means it's the best practice to disclose it. And so, me as an auditor, I could not, because I can't look to a requirement to report it then. I couldn't issue an audit finding that says they were non-compliant with that guidance that's in the addendum.
Right. And so it's do the best that you can. That was one of the reasons that landed on that you could say that it was an unaudited amount there, is because it is a best practice, and knowing that there are going to be some difficulties in even obtaining those amounts. So the idea is to try to capture that information, but understanding that there are problems with that. So it was a should for a reason. It's a best practice to do that, and please do that and make an effort to do that. But understanding that an auditor is not going to write a finding against you if you're unable to do that, or if it comes back later that number was not exactly correct. And so,
okay, thank you, Tammy.
Okay, so are we ready to go ahead and turn to the next section?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so hopefully I have control. I did a minute ago. Okay, I do. Great. So what we're going to talk about today, we've already talked about kind of the technical side of uniform guidance, the technical side of the compliance supplement. Now we're going to talk about, in single audits, how federal agencies use the single audits, and then also an initiative that keeps circling about using the single audits to help measure improper payments, or to measure improper payments. And we're going to talk about some of the difficulties with reconciling that. And it has come around at least 3 times since I have been with HHS, and I've been with HHS, I'm going on my 21st year. So I know 3 times we've circled this, using single audits to measure improper payments. And so I wanted to kind of touch on that. And then the third area that I'd like to touch on today is just some quality issues that we see during peer reviews, quality control reviews, and desk reviews in single audits, and how it's important to improve that quality so that we can rely upon those audits to make meaningful impact for program integrity. And so the first area I want to talk about, of course, is that how federal agencies use. HHS, being one of the largest grant-making agencies for the federal grants, with approximately $900 billion in grants for state and local communities, and then HHS having $175 billion from just related to the Provider Relief Fund for COVID pandemic response. And so if you look at that and look at how large it is important to understand that we've got to be able to leverage our resources, because there is no way, as George said, with 35,000 single audits that are submitted, and then you have grantees that don't submit single audits, those being those that are under the threshold, and then those that actually are for-profits or foreign entities, then you can see that there's no way that with the 710 employees that the HHS Inspector General has, that we could touch 35,000 entities. And there's no way that the program officials could touch that many entities. So we have to rely on a mechanism to provide us with a snapshot of what is going on for those entities and how our funds are being actually administered out at these different grantees. And so the strongest tool that we have at this point to help give us that snapshot is the single audit. And what it does for us is, one thing, because the single audit requires an understanding and then an assessment and designing controls for a low-level assessed risk for major programs, it helps us to leverage those control findings and that control work in the 35,000 audit reports that are submitted, so that when we go to do our internal control work at the federal financial statement level, we can have some assurance on those controls working at those lower levels, so we can focus more on those controls up at the federal level that in pushing the money out versus at the level of where the administration of those funds is being actually administered down at those grantees. So it helps us leverage that and reduce our cost in the federal level, and helps us identify problems that we see in a certain program and in controls related to a certain program. So it helps us to identify if we have an issue across the program or with a separate subset of entities. We did use some single audit information and identified some control information in a review that was done that indicated that there were control problems with the payroll that was being charged to federal programs. And some of the payroll issues were that there were advance payments that were being paid to employees and full salaries were being paid to employees. And that there were also controls over who could authorize an increase in pay for an employee. And so we saw that there were some problems in the single audits related to that. And then we saw that that was across a certain group of types of grantees. And so HHS actually did a project that they called Smoke and Mirrors. And they went in and they looked at those controls, looked at compliance, and looked at what's being charged. That initiative resulted in HHS being able to actually have enforcements for fraud, actions for fraud, and actually ended up with indicting individuals who had been inappropriately double dipping and getting like 2 salaries because they would take an advance and they were authorizing this themselves, and then they were also able to get their full salary and they never paid back those advances. And so it wasn't just in one entity. We were able to see that there was a certain subset of grantees that this was occurring, and we were able to identify that from findings in internal controls with the tip-off, and then also we had an initial complaint in one of the entities. And so then when we started investigating, we realized that this was a much bigger problem, and we were able to strengthen that area and monitor many more entities than we could have possibly monitored without the single audit as being a place to start identifying those control problems. So that is one way that we use that, is that we look for certain anomalies that occur and certain findings across the program or down a program, and then we can dedicate resources. The program people look at the single audits to help them identify where they may need to send out program officials to either help with technical assistance to improve program activities, or to send out people to do site visits because they're seeing material noncompliance that is repeated year after year. And so it helps them target where they're going to spend their limited resources for sending their own personnel out to do those site visits. Another area that we use the single audit information is that anytime we're developing an audit lead and we're starting an audit, the auditors in IG or an investigation will request a copy of the most recent single audits, and they'll look at the findings in that to determine are there certain risk areas that they need to incorporate in their audit planning or their investigation planning. So the single audit is a very useful product for us because it helps us direct our work and it helps us reduce our effort and not overlap in some of the areas. So we can focus on the key important areas and those areas that we've identified as high risk, and not just, I attended an AICPA webinar and they were talking about internal controls. It's like where you're actually serving the tennis ball and you're serving that information versus just throwing a bunch of darts out or a bunch of tennis balls out and hoping that it sticks and you get a problem. Now we're able to focus and find where our problems are likely to be and then take our money and follow up on that, which is the intent of the single audit, because again, it's just a scrape across the top. It's not a deep dive into the problem. And that's why the single audit is to determine, do you have compliance or not measure the extent of that. And so that's where we like to say, we've now been told we have a problem. Now we need to go figure out how deep that problem is and how we can fix that problem. And so the single audit gives us a lot of valuable information there. So turning to our next topic that was assigned to me is that, as I stated, at least 3 times in my tenure, we've had work groups to discuss whether or not the single audit can be used to measure improper payments. And each time we've come back to the same conclusion. The first is that there's scope limitations between what is required under the Single Audit Act for the single audit versus what is required whenever you are trying to measure improper payments. One being is that under the single audit, you're not required to perform statistical sampling. And the samples that are used, because you're only trying to test enough to be able to determine whether there is material noncompliance and not measure that material noncompliance, are quite small, because you only have to identify that you have a problem, not how big the problem is. Improper payments, you're trying to measure how big the problem is. And so that is one difference, where your samples are small, and also you're focusing on the areas in your single audit that are likely to result in material noncompliance. So there are subsets that you're not required to test, because if you've determined that even if you tested 100% of these costs, you would never reach material noncompliance, you're not going to test those. And so if you're truly trying to test improper payments, you're going to have to look across the entire body of the improper payments and figure out how to test and include those to be able to project to that and actually create a measurement of that. So that's one scope limitation, and that is embedded in the Single Audit Act itself and the intent of the Single Audit Act. So to get around that, you would have to open up the Single Audit Act and make changes there before you could use that. Now, other problems that we see with trying to use the Single Audit Act to measure improper payments is that, remember that major programs are determined each year. And so the programs that you are trying to measure the improper payments on may not be required to be a major program every year that you're trying to measure improper payments. So you would not be required to test in those years where it wasn't a major program, so you would have no data. And so that's one area that, because of the risk-based approach that's set up in the Single Audit Act, that you would not be able to necessarily rely consistently on those audit procedures, because those programs don't have to be audited every year. And so that's one. Another one is that measurement of improper payments is a management function, not an auditor responsibility. So it is a management responsibility that you're trying to push on to the auditors. And so that creates a problem in that if you're trying to say that the auditors now have to measure this, you have problems with standards and possible problems with the independent standards that GAO has outlined in government auditing standards, that you can't be part of management and still conduct that audit. So that would be problematic there. Another area that makes this problematic is that just the definition of a question cost doesn't equal an improper payment. And so one item is that there is no standard or requirement or standardization of how question costs are identified or reported in the single audit. So you may have one group of auditors that, if they have documentation problems, will actually question the entire cost, where another auditor may not question that because it's merely a documentation problem. So is that an improper payment if it's merely that in the documentation they didn't check a box so they weren't fully compliant, where the actual service that was provided was the appropriate service for a person that should receive those benefits? And so it's very difficult to say that a question cost, which is basically just, we may not have the documentation for that, we don't have full information on that, we're not able to actually determine that that was an allowable cost or whether or not it was not an allowable cost. In a single audit could be reported. And so even a question cost is not equal to an unallowable cost whenever you're reporting in a single audit, because there's no standardization on how those are reported, how they're calculated, and so that is problematic. And then you go to that the definition of improper payments includes not only costs that were, or not only payments that should not have gone to someone, they're payments that may have been in the wrong amount. So maybe the person should have received $100 and they received $50, versus maybe someone received $100 and they should have received $0. So the improper payment measurement actually incorporates more than what a question cost or an unallowable cost would. So you would first have to reconcile that definition and figure out how to standardize reporting and then reconcile the definitions between question cost and improper payments. And that's going to take a lot of work to be able to do that. And you would have to go into the Single Audit Act, you'd have to go into the statute supporting the improper payments measurement, and then have to look at how you're going to reconcile those before you can get those. So there's a lot of questions that still have to be answered and problems that would still have to be overcome to be able to use the single audit to measure improper payments. Now, does that not mean that you can't use, doesn't mean that you can't use the single audit information to help you direct and find riskier areas when management is doing those measurements, and where they may need to focus some of their efforts to actually extend their measurement procedures. Because, you know, if it's in a single audit that is a problem area, then that is a key to management that maybe more attention needs to be given to that area. So certainly we could use it in that manner, but to actually do a measurement at this point, there's going to have to be a lot more work and some changes, fundamental changes, before we could do that. And so I know that that's disappointing, because we would all like to have a mechanism that makes the measurement of improper payments easier. But the single audit as it currently stands is not our mechanism at this point. And that's what all three groups that I have been on, that been a part of when this has come up, has concluded, is that we wish we could get there, but we don't see how we can get there at this point, and for some of these reasons. So let's go to the last area, And my last area that I wanted to talk about is, because we rely so heavily on the single audit to help us improve integrity of federal programs, it's important that we have quality audits. And it's important that we are comparing apples to oranges when we're looking at these audit reports, because a no-finding audit report that was done by an auditor that cut corners is not equal to a no-finding audit report that was done that met all of the standards and the requirements for the single audit. So it is very important that we monitor and ensure the integrity of the single audit so that we can rely on those at the federal level and for, in George's cases, the subrecipient level where the pass-through entities can monitor their subrecipients. And so the first thing that we do see is that there's inaccurate information on the schedule of federal expenditures. And so some of the inaccurate information that we might see is that they don't cluster programs appropriately, or they'll create their own clusters. And so then whenever auditors go to try to plan testing, they actually will group programs together as a cluster, and they will misidentify their major programs. And so they run the risk of not auditing the appropriate programs for the period. In other cases, we've seen where whole departments that are not in centralized accounting systems but have manual accounting systems that feed into the CFA presentation have been left off the CFA. And in doing so, they have actually understated those federal expenditures, which has thrown off the calculation for the thresholds and thrown off the major program determination, also resulting in missed major programs that are programs that are higher volume programs that would be classified into a Type A program that hadn't been audited in the past 3 years is one of the areas that you'll see just from the CFA if there's problems with that. Other areas are where they use inappropriate criteria to select a program as a major program or to not select a program as a major program. We'll see where every risk factor for a B program is checked as a higher risk, and then they conclude that B program is a low risk, so they don't have to pick that up to replace for a low risk A. And it's like, okay, well, how can you have every risk factor checked yes and conclude that it's low risk? And so those are problems that we'll see. A very big problem, and this gets right to the quality of findings and the lack of findings, is when auditors fail to gain an appropriate understanding of the internal controls so that they can evaluate those to see if they're operating effectively, designed effectively, and then test whether or not they're operating effectively to support a low level of assessed control risk, to support the reduced compliance testing. If they haven't gained that understanding to begin with, and they're not testing actual controls, then you can't support that compliance level of testing, and you can't rely on those results. We'll see many times that the understanding will describe processes but not identify controls within that process, or they'll identify a litany of controls and then they'll test all of those, and then they may have where half of them aren't operating appropriately, and then they conclude that the control system is operating effectively at a low level of assessed control risk. And it's like, okay, well, obviously, if you have half of them not operating properly, there's some judgment in there that I'm not able to follow as an experienced auditor to get to the same conclusion. So that's where we see, typically, we'll see that auditors try to use dual purpose testing for compliance and internal controls. And when you look at what they've tested, there is nothing that tests an actual control that's related to the administration of that program for that compliance requirement. Many times what we'll see is that they try to claim that their payroll testing for their financial statements is their control testing for allowable cost, allowable activities for the payroll piece. in compliance for the program, and there's nothing to tie those together. And so they're really not testing a control to be able to reduce down their compliance sampling. We see a lot of sampling issues. Probably the most prevalent sampling problem that we see is trying to take a subset of a sample, and this typically happens when they change their sampling unit midstream. So they may start out with a sampling unit and say that it is all county offices, the expenditures for all county offices. And then they'll pick 7 county offices. They've got 7 county offices, and they'll say, okay, we're going to audit one of the 7 county offices. And then they'll say, now we're going to select 20 expenditures from that one county office. So what they've effectively done is they've changed their sampling unit from a county office to an expenditure midstream. And so they've only tested from the one county office. And so they can only project their results over that one county office. So really their sampling unit is all of the expenditures for all county offices, and they would need to design appropriately. And so that's what we call sampling from a sample. And so that creates problems with being able to project your samples and project your results. We also see where they exclude material areas. One that we used to see in the Medicaid problem, which has improved in the Medicaid area, which has improved significantly over the years, is that if you took the CMS 64 cost report and you compared the categories that are reported on that report to the subcategories of where the testing was actually performed for their claims testing, you might see that they have, out of a sample of 20, with 14 of those being pharmacy claims, and maybe one of those being an in-hospital claim, and then maybe one being outpatient, and then you may have like 4 dental. And so basically when we looked at the categories, we were able to look at either individually or in the aggregate, the categories that they did not test from represented material portions of the expenditures for and the Medicaid claims for the program. And so we would say that, okay, if you're not testing, and in one case, our worst case that we saw, they didn't test from 95% of the claims that are reported on the 64. And so we said, well, if you're only testing from 5% of the claims that are on the 64 report, you did not gain enough evidence to support your opinion on the program as a whole. And so we do see sampling problems in that area. The other area that we see a lot of problems with the single audit, and I'm coming close to time, so I'm going to be real careful with that, is we see where they have exceptions for everything that they've tested, and then they say that this was an isolated incident. So their evaluation process of the results sometimes is flawed, where a reasonable person could not reach the same conclusion, and then an experienced auditor could not reach the same conclusion based on the results. Or they'll say that it is just non-compliant when they had all of the items that they tested were non-compliant. And you're like, okay, how am I getting that that's just non-compliance and not material non-compliance? Or they'll have nothing to support their classification documented at all. They just magically appear in the report at some level. And you're going, okay, well, how did you get from the test work to the report? Because I can't get in between the two. And then we often see reporting issues where we see conflicts between what's reported in the actual report and in the summary schedule of auditor's results. We'll see conflicts between what is in the actual findings and what's reported in the actual report. One of the worst cases we saw was where they actually had 2 findings that were word for word for a program, except for the question cost. And when we started diving into it, they're like, oh yeah, we didn't edit properly. That wasn't the correct finding. And so their second finding, they didn't have any support for that second finding. It was actually related to a completely different area. And so we had to reject that audit report because their findings weren't supported. And then they actually ended up having to go back and do some additional test work as well because they couldn't support the results, and they needed to be able to support the results that they were reporting. And the finding in the completely different area was correct, but they hadn't done some of the follow-up work that they needed to. They dropped that and just copied and pasted another finding and put the question cost in there. And it's like, yeah, you can't really do that. And so we do see reporting issues from time to time as well. And I think that brings me up to time, doesn't it, Bert?
Yes, it does, Tammy. Thank you so much. I think that, certainly the audit quality issues is very important to understand and really, speaks to, why it's important to get that quality audit for a lot of purposes. And as you can tell from what Tammy said, that these single audit reports are used and, very important to have it done in a quality manner. I'll start off with one question that, there was a question with regards to when does a single audit be required, and that's based on federal grant expenditures of $750,000 or more in your fiscal year. So just keep that in mind. That's the what you need to track to if you are a recipient of federal money, whether that be as a prime recipient directly from the federal government or as a subrecipient from a pass-through entity. So thank you for that question. We do have a lot of great questions. I'm not sure that we will get to all of them. So if we don't happen to get to your question and you'd like to direct it to someone, please email the AGA after the session, and Kia or Des will get that question to one of the panelists for them to follow up directly with your question. I wanted to start with a question with regards to, this relates to the CARES Act, the Local Government Relief Fund, and CFDA number 21.019, the CARES Act Local Government Relief Fund, is a FY21 grant, but allows governments to go back to March through June of 2020 to identify expenses to use for the grants. Do these expenses get reported on the government's FY20 or FY21 CFA? I'm assuming from this question that we are talking about a June 30th fiscal year end. And so I'll just open that question up. Maybe, George, you want to start with that, and then maybe Tammy add on?
Yeah, I can start, and I'm going to give the typical question. Well, it depends really on when was on really two things looking at it there. One, what is the basis of accounting for the CFA that's used? Some use cash basis, some are full accrual. And then when did management make their decision to use that qualifying expenditure to claim for CRF funds? Those are the two things that come into play. So if it's full accrual and management made the decision after fiscal year end, you could make the case that, oh, well, then that expenditure needs to go on the 2020 CFA. If it's cash basis and management waited for time to pass and covered that expenditure originally, let's say with their general funds, then that's where that expenditure is as a fiscal year end. The general fund cash was used to make that purchase, let's just say a PPE. And if it's not until later that the management decides to change the federal cash they already received, because that's the one thing that's different about CRF is that it was an advanced grant and a lot of advanced funded in a lot of cases to the states and the large localities. then you would pick it up in the 2021. So it depends on the basis of accounting and the timing of the management decision, all play in there. Tammy?
Exactly, that's correct. And then I would also say that stay tuned for PRF, because with the provider relief fund, there are some uniqueness on when that's going to be reported, and the addendum addressed for those subject to single audit, and then there should be some guidance coming out for the for-profit or commercial entities as well soon. So I would say, you're exactly on target, but there's a few unique items with the PRF. Yeah,
I'm glad you brought up the PRF, Tammy, because there is that. If you are a hospital or I guess a medical provider and you receive PRF, highly recommend you go to the addendum and read the section related to CFA, disclosing that information in the CFA.
Okay, thank you. Next question, I'm going to direct first to Barry, and then just ask others to interject as you see necessary. This one relates to: am I correct to assume that even though a particular requirement isn't marked as a Y and in the compliance supplement and subject to audit, it is still required? Example, cash management. Wouldn't non-compliance still be reported?
Yeah, it would still be required, if that's the simple answer to the question. Yes. Does everybody agree on the panel? Okay.
Yeah, that was a change when they did. I just want to elaborate on that, because that's a change in, I think it was last year, the 2019 compliance supplement, where it used to be the Y was applicable, meaning it was applicable to the program. But now they've changed that Y to mean it is subject to audit. So the auditee would still have the requirement to comply. It's not necessarily that the auditor would be compelled to audit it in all situations.
Right. And I think the second part of that I wanted to chime in is because they said, would it not still need to be reported? Certainly the compliance requirement is required of the grantee. It's not required to be tested by the auditor, but remember that you also have if you trip over it and it's a problem, you can report that finding. So you're not precluded, and I kind of use that generic term, but you're not precluded from reporting it if for some reason during your normal audit work or your interviews with the auditees, you know that there is a material problem. You're not precluded from reporting it. The auditors are just not required to perform audit steps specifically related to that compliance requirement for that program. And so that's where the difference is.
Yeah, and Tammy, it doesn't even have to be, in some cases, material. It has. I mean, if you find some case that it's question cost of $25,000, I know I use the program income. I mean, if you find out that they're taking $30,000 of program income, which is above $25,000, and using it inappropriately, you would have to report that as an audit finding.
Absolutely. And so that's where it's still required, and that's one of the things, the messages that we wanted to make sure with going to the PIC 6 that was communicated, is that all of the requirements that are in the terms and conditions for the award are still applicable to that award. The auditors just may not be required to test all of those terms and conditions, and they've never been required to test all of the terms and conditions. And this just was streamlining to try to target on those compliance requirements that were most likely to result in audit findings, and most likely to encourage the reduction of fraud, waste, and abuse.
Thank you. I think we have time for one question. I'll direct this first to George, and then others can add. Based on what you said, auditors can apply auditor's judgment when determining which requirements are direct and material to the program. What about program income and special test and provisions requirements? can auditors decide program income is direct and material, or I'd say is not direct and material if the program income and already received is not material to the program?
So I'm trying to understand that. So that'd be a case where the federal awarding agency designated it with a Y and made it subject to audit, or is this, or maybe it's the opposite. So if the federal government, the opposite. So let's say the federal government put an N in there, N as in Nancy, as not subject to audit. As Tammy already alluded to, I could, if I find that there is an error in there, or I feel like it's highly susceptible to non-compliance, I could still go in and audit it, not only from that standpoint, but it may not be material to the program itself, but to the amounts reported in the financial statements. Because, and I'll just take my own case where there were some programs where the federal government awarded money to the state, and then that resulted in billions of dollars going down to subrecipients. But then the federal government said, oh, well, we're not going to make subrecipient monitoring subject to audit. Underneath of the financial statement audit, because we felt subrecipient monitoring was material to the amounts reported in the financial statements, because I had to look to see, well, is there non-compliance at the subrecipient level of such magnitude that there's an undisclosed liability in the financial statements? And the only way to get that assurance was to actually go test the subrecipient monitoring program of the state, even though it was not subject to audit. So I was doing that work as an extension of the financial statement audit, not part of the compliance audit, to render an opinion, because the federal government had said subrecipient monitoring was not subject to audit. I use that. Maybe Tammy, do you see it differently?
I'm just going to go to the reverse side of that. And if there was a yes in that, if you're documenting both qualitative and quantitative considerations, and that the way that the program is operated at that entity, that it would not be material or have a material impact, or does not actually even apply, then you can get there. But I would caveat that in saying, be very careful of just relying on the expenditures related to that particular requirement, especially in the special test and provisions, whenever you're concluding that it's not material and direct. I'll give you an example. The FUCU test, I believe it's test number 6 in the Medicaid compliance supplement. That testing, if you look at the expenditures for the NAFUCU program, they're very small in relation to the medical assistance expenditures for the Medicaid program. And that is a cluster. And so if you were to compare the expenditures only and conclude that that special test and provision related to NAFUCU was not material and direct, that would be an inappropriate conclusion, because you have to understand that the purpose of that special test and provision is not the expenditures or the allowable cost, allowable activities related to that. It is the activity, and that the NAFUCU unit is a key control in helping to monitor fraud, waste, and abuse in the Medicaid program, specifically fraud in the Medicaid program. So you would need to be looking at what that audit objective was, and then make that conclusion both qualitatively and quantitatively based on that audit objective and what the purpose of that is. And as long as you were looking at the operating environment of the entity that's being tested, and you are documenting qualitative and quantitatively why that would not be material and direct, or why it would not be applicable, you could get to a yes in subject to audit for an entity, because it doesn't apply to your auditee. And so I wanted to do that other side of that when you could, but be very careful and document well if you're going to do that.
Very good advice. Thank you so much. So we are out of time. We appreciate everyone joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Des to make a few final comments for us.
Yes, thank you, Bert. And I know we are over time, so I just wanted to say a quick thank you to you, Barry, George, and Tammy for your discussion today on this very important and timely topic. And of course, a special thank you to Bert and Paul for moderating today and for your organization and leadership in ensuring today's webinar was successful. So with that, we